So welcome to Environmental Science. In this first section, we're going to look at an overview of the course. We're going to look at an overview of what environmental science is. We'll look at a little bit of its history. We'll talk about some of the important scientists and environmentalists and naturalists that contributed to our understanding of environmental science. So environmental science is more than just looking at wildlife. And that's a lot of times what the perception is of environmental science. But really, this is looking at an interconnectedness between people and the environment. So we look at how the natural environment works as a system. We'll look at the variety of systems that are on Earth. And if you look down here at this graphic, you'll see we look at our life support systems, those things that keep Earth functioning and keep life alive. And then we'll look at how do people interact with those systems. And so there's a lot of things, they call it our culture sphere, but it really is just all those things that are about us as humans that make us different from other animals. We have a lot of different factors that influence our decisions when it comes to the environment. Our population size is a huge contributing factor. But with that, we also have our economic systems, we have our political systems that both make a difference, and they influence and color how it is that we treat the environment and where we place our priorities. We also have our worldviews and our ethics. So how do we see the planet? Okay, is it something to be used? Is it something to be appreciated? Is it something to be shared? That will color our view of what should be, how the environment should be handled, and also our ethics. So we'll also talk in this course about how do we interact with our environment and live within our planet and live sustainably so that we're not degrading those life support systems. Because we have to remember that we're on a little bit of a spaceship here out in the middle of the universe, and we only have what we have right now. And so we have to keep that in mind as we utilize our resources, that many of them are finite, and that if we use them up, we won't have them anymore. Environmental science involves a great number of topics, and as you can see on this graphic. So not only do we have the traditional science side of it with our biology, looking at that study of life, ecology, our study of our ecosystems. We look at chemistry and physics because we're looking at how matter cycles, and we're looking at how with our matter, not only the chemistry of that matter cycling, but also that matter can't be created or destroyed, and that energy can't be created or destroyed. It's simply changing forms as it flows through our ecosystem. We look at geology when we're looking at our mineral resources, also at our part of our life support, which is our soil and our ground. We look at geography because we look at spatially how people are distributed across the planet. So we're looking at the lay of the land and how people are distributed across that. And then we get into our social sciences because we can't make decisions without keeping in mind who we are and where we came from, because that all colors our view of how we treat the environment. So we talked a little bit about demography is looking at those human populations. We talked a little bit about economics and politics. Philosophy and religion does play a role because for many cultures that is an integral part of how they interact with the environment. So we're kind of going to bring all these things back around into our course. In first semester, we tend to focus a little bit more on this side over here in the biology, in the more traditional sciences, and then a little bit later on towards the end of the semester, and then in environmental science 2 is really where we start to pick up all the social sciences. So when we talk about how we interact with the environment, one of the primary things that we think of is the resources that we get from the environment. And so we've got different categories of natural resources based on the amount of time that it takes in order for those to be replaced, if they can be. So we have those perpetual ones, the ones that never go away, and that's solar energy. Our sun is about halfway through its life cycle. We've got about 4.5 billion years left with our sun, so we're going to call that one a constant. We have our renewable resources, which are ones that usually we look at this as, can they be renewed within a lifetime, within a generation? So we're looking at about 30 years. So between 0 and 30 years, can those things be replenished? And if they can, then they're considered renewable. Now, we can't make more water, right? But water goes through the water cycle, okay? And it can be cleaned. Not all of it, obviously, but it does cycle through. And so water evaporates up into the sky, it falls down as rain, comes back in different areas. When we talk about air, we're talking about oxygen and carbon cycling through the carbon cycle, moving through plants, where carbon dioxide moves through plants and is transformed back into oxygen. Our renewable resources of our forests and our grasslands. Now, forests, it's particular kinds of forests, obviously. We have some really large old growth trees, for example, in Northern California and the sequoias, that those would not be considered a renewable resources, but those are an exception. Most trees are going to regenerate within a lifetime, as long as we haven't completely depleted the soil. The same thing with our grasslands. Our non-renewable are those ones that would take longer than a generation in order to be replenished, and so we consider those to be fixed quantities. If we mine all of the areas where we know of right now that these materials are available, then it's going to take Earth a really long time in order to go through the rock cycle in order to produce more of these. So we look at our fossil fuels, so we're looking at our coal and oil and natural gas, and we're looking at our minerals. All of these things that are mined. Another thing you're going to look at this week is your ecological footprint. So we talk about what are our resources that we have available to us on our planet, and then how do we use those resources? And that's what an ecological footprint is. It's that measure of how much do we use our resources, and how many Earths will we need to support our lifestyle. So we can look at it as per capita, which is per person. We can look at it by nation. We can look at it by continent. And you're going to be using a calculator to calculate your ecological footprint, and then look at where are the areas where you could reduce your footprint just a little bit. Some of what determines how many resources we use varies by where we live. And so in this example, what we're looking at are developed versus developing countries. So a developed nation is a first world nation like the United States, like Canada, like the UK. Most of Western Europe would be considered developed nations. Versus our developing countries, which are earlier on in the stages of industrialization. They have higher levels of poverty, and usually coupled with a really large population. India, for an example, is considered a developing country. Many of our smaller island nations would be considered developing. Many times developing nations are primarily dependent upon agriculture as their primary mode of making money. You can see that from the graph over here on this side that the wealth and the resource use, and then also the pollution and waste, are not equally distributed around the planet. Looking at that, a very small part of our population actually is the wealthiest and has most of those resources. And you can see a lot of that is concentrated in Western Europe and in North America. Some of the areas where you don't see a lot of poverty, you also see extremely small population centers in some of those areas as well. So when we look at Australia, there's not very many people who live in the middle of Australia. So if you were going to see levels of poverty, they would be around the edges, and you're not seeing it there. So we're looking at areas where, especially like up in here, there's up in the top part of Canada and Greenland, Iceland, up that area, there's just not many people up there. So we're not seeing high levels of poverty. But in areas where you have large concentrations of people that are together and limited resources available to them is where we see increasing levels of poverty. So you're going to look at your ecological footprint, like I said, in one of the activities today, and you're going to be able to compare countries to one another. You'll see a little bit more recent numbers than the ones that are here on your screen right now. But the proportions are still relatively similar. We look at higher footprints in our more developed nations, lower footprints in our less developed nations. So we have environmental issues and environmental problems. One of those main reasons is because of our exponential population growth. We're reaching 7 billion people on the planet. Actually, we just surpassed 7 billion people on the planet. And whenever you have that large of a concentration of people in areas, you're going to have environmental degradation that results because of that. In some areas, it's that wasteful and unsustainable resource use, what we were looking at before with the ecological footprints. People who are living in poverty tend to have larger amounts of environmental problems. When your main concern is how do you survive, how do you get food for your family, how do you get shelter for your family, other things kind of take a back seat because you're worried about survival. And so areas with higher levels of poverty tend to have higher levels of environmental issues as well. You tend to have less access to services. You have less access to things like centralized plumbing, okay, and so you have more pollution as a result of that. One of the reasons, another reason why we have those environmental issues, this fourth bullet point, we don't really charge the amount of money that something's worth. So I want you to think about like a ballpoint pen, for example, and we're not talking an expensive one. I'm talking like, the plastic Bic pen. And think about, or a pencil even, think about how many of those you've lost since the beginning of the school year. So, excuse me, probably a few have lost. You've lost a few pens, you've lost a few pencils, but it's not really a large concern because it doesn't cost very much. And it doesn't cost very much because some of those prices, some of that cost of what it took to mine the petroleum to make the plastic, to make the ink, to mine the metals, to make the little metal nibs on it or anything like that, all of that isn't necessarily included in the market price of that pen. If it were, the cost of the pen would be higher, we'd be a little bit more concerned about losing it. But when we have a lot of very inexpensive products that either break easily or they're very easy to replace, we tend not to worry about that, and that leads to more waste. Once again, a lot of this comes back around to we don't really understand necessarily how nature works, and so what happens to that. And one of the things you're going to hear me say a lot in this course is that there is no away. So that magical away place, so where did that broken pen go? Where did that lost pen go? There is no away. It had to go somewhere. And understanding what happens when we dispose of our products, when we put things in the landfill, when we put things into the storm drains, or something like that. Some of that, not having that knowledge about what happens to our earth because of how we dispose of things, can lead to some of those environmental issues. So we've changed over time, and a lot of this deals with our population growth. When we were very small as a human population, and we started out actually with hunter-gatherers. So you had very small family units because it was difficult to find food, and so they had followed smaller family sizes because you could only support a smaller amount of people. And then really the dawn of agriculture happened in the Tigris and Euphrates river valleys in the Middle East. And as we started as a people to settle in one place and we figured out how to plant things, this was the agricultural revolution. And this is where humanity learned how to not have to follow their food, but they could actually cause their food to be in one place during a certain time, which led to a much more stable food supply. It allowed people to stay in one place, and now as you have that food supply, your population can start to grow because now you can support a larger family, and then it kind of becomes this little cycle of I have more people in my family, therefore I need to grow more food. It takes more people in order to take care of those crops and to harvest and to process the food and to save the food and all of that. And so I need more help, and so we have more people, and so it kind of became this kind of circle, and our population really started to increase during the agricultural revolution. Our next revolution was the industrial medical revolution. So now we had our farming regions, and we were very rural. People still tended to be spread out, but you had the beginnings of cities. and towns and things. In the Industrial Medical Revolution, now we could start to produce products very quickly. We started to have machines doing the work of people, and we had this shift. It's called a push-pull effect. So people were feeling pulled to the cities. So especially if there was crop failure or something like that, there was now a place to go where there was work, where they could try to earn money to buy food, as opposed to raising their own food because their crops failed. So there was that push away from the agricultural regions because of either crop failure or people were, you know, young people in particular, maybe they weren't excited about being farmers and they wanted to go, you know, to the city and try to be something else other than what they were. So they felt pushed out and they felt pulled towards the city. Well, whenever you start to put a lot of people into small areas, that's where you start to have some issues with sanitation and things like that. So we actually saw a little bit of a dip in our population during the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. But as the medical revolution started to take off, this is where we started to have better healthcare, better sanitation. So people are now living longer because they had things like, for example, penicillin. So things where people used to die of very common illnesses now that we can take an antibiotic for, now those people are surviving. And so now you have longer survival rates, you have fewer infant deaths, you have a more stable food supply coming in, and so your population really started to increase. Right now, we're in the midst of the information globalization revolution, and this is largely because of our increases in technology. When you hear the phrase, the earth is, you know, everything's getting smaller every day, because you can communicate with people all around the world due to our technology. So as we look at what do we do to kind of mitigate some of the problems that we're going to talk about, one of the things that we're going to come back to is these 4 principles of sustainability. So we want to rely more on solar energy as opposed to fossil fuels. Solar energy is a perpetual resource, we said. It's not going to go away, and there's no pollution involved in using it. So the more that we can rely on solar energy, the less impactful we will be. We want to protect our biodiversity, and we'll talk about biodiversity quite a bit as we move through this semester. But it's that idea that biodiverse areas, or ones that have a large number of species in them, are more stable. And so the more stable our ecosystems are, the less likely they are to collapse, and the more likely we are to have sustainability. We don't want to get in the way of nutrient cycling. We'll talk about different nutrient cycles. We'll talk about the sulfur cycle, the carbon cycle, the phosphorus cycle. And these are all nutrients that are really important to our life support systems, to our ecosystems in general. And so we want to make sure that we're not either putting too much of a nutrient into our ecosystems and that we're not pulling too much out of it either. And we'll also talk a little bit about population control. We'll talk about how nature controls populations. And then we'll talk a little bit about what will happen if we have uncontrolled population growth. So when we look at our 4 principles of sustainability, really our current emphasis right now is on cleaning up our problems, cleaning up our messes. We make a mess, we clean it up. So we got to clean up the pollution. We got to bury the waste. We got to protect the species that we've almost killed off due to overhunting or to removing their habitat or fragmenting their habitat. So on the left-hand side in the box, it's really about, here's issues that we've created as a people, and then how do we fix those issues? As opposed to, if we're looking at the sustainability emphasis, it's about preventing those problems before they start. So instead of making the pollution, let's figure out how to create energy, to create products, to do what we need to do without making as much pollution. It's a lot harder to take pollution out of the air than it is to not put it in the air to begin with. And so that's that sustainability emphasis, is about not creating the problems, but let's head it off before it gets there. And so everything that's in this green box over here is about that preventive, let's keep it from happening. our population is rapidly expanding. So we talked about our different periods in time for us. We talked about being hunter-gatherers, and then agriculture started, and that's where our population started to increase. This Black Death plague, this was really the beginnings of when people started coming into cities and coming close together, and that's one reason why the plague actually spread as much as it did, because we started to have cities. But then you can see after that, that through the Industrial Revolution and Medical Revolution, we just started to explode. Our population has rapidly increased over the last 1,000 years. And so we have to look at what kind of impacts this will have on our society and on our planet, and what are we going to do? You have several assignments that you're going to be working on through this. There are also in your packet, you have some case studies that we didn't talk about. One of them is about Chattanooga, Tennessee, and how they were trying to model these principles of sustainability. And then you also have a case study about the exponential growth that's occurring in China, and some of the things that they're looking at that they were trying to do in order to help to slow their population growth. So in order to complete those, you need to go to your textbook, which is in that textbook section, or hopefully you've already downloaded it, so that you can fill in the parts from the case studies. Anything that's in your packet can show up on a quiz and can show up on your final. So you want to make sure that you're filling in those notes as you go along. If you need to, you can go back through this video and you can look at it again in order to get your notes filled in if you missed any.